Okay, that's fine. Okay. Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Vamos a tener un nuevo conversatorio con un invitado que ustedes han estado esperando con mucha atención, James Robinson de la Universidad de Chicago. Es Chicago de los buenos. Y es Chicago de los buenos. Hay buena gente en Chicago, evidentemente. Y antes de comentar, de empezar, quiero hacer algunas aclaraciones. Quienes quieran oír en vivo la presentación de James, pueden hacerlo en el canal de Facebook, que va a estar transmitiendo desgraciadamente solo en inglés. La traducción simultánea, por alguna razón, quedó solo disponible en el Zoom. Si alguien que quiere ver la presentación en el Zoom y entrar, por lo tanto, a la transmisión en vivo con traducción simultánea, me hace llegar un correo a guillermo.larraín@gmail.com. De todas formas, va a haber la traducción, va a quedar una versión con traducción simultánea grabada en el sitio web, pero desgraciadamente por algún problema que quedó de esta forma. Entonces, en Facebook solo va a estar la versión en inglés, ¿no? Hoy día va a estar luego la traducción total después. Quisiera, bueno, James es un economista, a pesar de que trabaja mucho desde la perspectiva de la historia. Yo mismo había pensado que más bien era historiador, pero es un economista de la London School of Economics y de Yale University, según me aclaró el amigo de James, Andrés Velasco. Me comentó hoy día que había un error en la invitación. Entonces, un economista, pero que se ha hecho muy famoso por trabajar en dos grandes libros que se llama ¿Por qué fracasan los países? En inglés, en español, y el Pasillo Estrecho, dos grandes libros en colaboración con Danora Acemoglu, que es un economista de MIT. Hoy día James está en la Universidad de Chicago y vamos a conversar con él sobre la situación chilena, pero vista desde una perspectiva más amplia, que es esta teoría del pasillo estrecho, ¿no? Es decir, que el camino al desarrollo está lleno de trampas y hay momentos en los cuales uno se acerca peligrosamente a situaciones de desgobierno, de gobiernos que básicamente tienden a diluirse y a desaparecer, donde el imperio de la ley desaparece, o a leviatanes tiránicos, ¿ah? Y hay un estrecho camino, un pasillo estrecho que algunas economías son capaces de superar, y no son muchas, y Chile está ahí en ese intento, está tratando de pasar por ahí. Entonces creo que es interesante para nuestro proceso constituyente tener esta conversación. Paso ahora al inglés para hablar con James. James, thank you very much for your generosity, for your intelligence, for your knowledge that you will share with us today. And we are really pleased in the name of all the people here. I'm currently in La Florida. Is one of the southern municipalities in Santiago. Is one of the municipalities in which I pretend to represent in the Constitutional Convention. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Un placer, placer. Estoy en Chicago, pero no soy un muchacho de Chicago. ¿Cómo se dice?
Chicago boy.
Muchacho de Chicago, no.
No. Chicago boy is well known in Chile, so you can use Chicago boy, just say that.
Pero desafortunadamente voy a hablar en inglés. Okay, thank you. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the book, the El Pasillo Estrecho, and the framework that we have for thinking about. The book is really about, and then I'll talk a little bit about my understanding of Chile. But I'm not an expert on Chile. I know much more about Colombia, which is very different.
It's also, yeah, but it's also different. Suffering similar situations nowadays, at least.
Very interesting. I could talk about that. Yeah. So I think so. What the book, all our work, both of the books that Senor Larraín mentioned are trying to understand the underpinnings of sort of prosperity. Why is it that some parts of the world historically developed these inclusive, prosperous economies with social mobility and broad-based opportunities, economic opportunities? And why is it they also developed capable states, can provide order, public services, democratic accountability? And why is it that that doesn't happen in other places? And the idea in the most recent book is very simple. It's that, you know, what you have to get right is a balance between elites and society. And when you get that balance right and you can sustain that balance, then you get a dynamic. We call this the Red Queen effect in the book, where the state takes on new roles, becomes more capable, more effective, but society challenges the state and works against the state and contests the state, and society becomes more cohesive and more powerful too at the same time. And it's this contest between state and society that actually creates prosperous, inclusive, democratic countries. So and just to contrast that with what happens when elites and society don't balance. Well, one obvious case where they don't balance is a place like China, where elites completely dominate society. The Communist Party dominates society. So that's a situation we call a despotic Leviathan in the book, because that's a situation where people have very little freedom, they have very little liberty. It's true that there's been a lot of prosperity in the last 40 years in China, but what we say is that that's not a sustainable situation. I think the history, world history, and even Chinese history shows that such concentrated political power, which is not balanced by the power of society, always ends up being abused at the expense of the population, at the expense of the economy. But then think of the other way. Think of the other way, where society dominates the elites or the state, like where? Like Yemen, for example, many places in the Middle East, Lebanon, where the state and elites are very weak and the power is all in society. But that's not a situation which leads to prosperity either. The state can't provide services, it can't provide order. That goes along with a lot of violence and conflict. And so it's in the middle where you have this balance. So of course, a country like Chile or even Colombia is not like, and Peru, I'll talk a little bit about Peru perhaps, is not like that. It's not like China. It's not where you have this powerful state dominating society. And it's not like Yemen either, or many countries in Africa where society is very powerful and the state is very weak. The state can't raise taxes, the state can't regulate, the state can't even build roads or do anything basic like provide education. Or so that's, Latin American countries are neither one thing nor the other. So in a sense, they're more balanced. But when we talk about Latin America in the book, we sort of say, yeah, but it's a particular sort of balance, which we call a paper Leviathan. You know, this is Chairman Mao Zedong said that, you know, the United States was like a paper tiger, was a kind of fake tiger. So the Latin American state for us is a sort of paper Leviathan, because it looks like a state, but it's very weak in many things, very weak in terms of providing services or order, or, you know, this is obvious in a place like Colombia. But society is also weak. Society is fragmented. It can't act collectively. It's riven by clientelistic relationships with politicians. So society is weak and the state is weak, and it's sort of stuck there. This is how we talk about Latin America. And I think of all the countries in Latin America, the one society which has moved furthest from a situation like that is clearly Chile. You know, compared to nearly everywhere else, Chile has the rule of law. The state is much more capable of taking natural resource wealth from copper or wherever and actually spending it on public services, on infrastructure, on health. And so, you know, just an example that everyone's talking about, which is the vaccination program. So Chile is up there with some of the most, you know, it's one of the big success stories in terms of vaccination. That's the result of the Chilean state having much more capacity, I would say. But Chile, in a sense, is still stuck because despite that success, story, and it's because of that it's the most prosperous country in Latin America, it still shares many things with other Latin American countries that keep it stuck in this situation. Let me give you some examples. My wife did her dissertation research in Chile, and one thing that really struck me hanging out with her in Chile is how oligarchic Chile is. It's so centered on Santiago. If you look at the kind of political class and you look at the kind of business elites, most of them, a majority of them, went to 4 Catholic boys' schools in Santiago. So there's this enormous kind of oligarchic feel and a hegemony of very few schools and opportunities. There's a fantastic piece of research by a former colleague of mine who's now at Yale called Seth Zimmerman, where he looked at the return to getting an education at the Católica or the Universidad de Chile. And he looked at what was the benefit of just getting into kind of select programs in economics and law. What was the benefit in terms of your future income and your future career? And what he showed is that there was no benefit whatsoever unless you went to one of these private schools. So what does that tell you? It tells you if you're not connected to the right people, then it doesn't matter what your education is, it's not going to pay off in terms of career success and economic success. So Chile still has that very oligarchic aspect to society. Another thing that I see in Chile, which really kind of reminds me of Colombia, is political elites really out of touch, with society. This is, you know more examples than I do, but all my Colombian friends were taught when the trouble started before the COVID, and there were all of these protests over the transportation in Santiago, the metro in Santiago, and destroying these stations and stuff. The wife of President Piñera said that, who are these aliens? Who are these aliens? But they're her fellow Chileans, so she just had no idea what people were so upset about. And that's a very Colombian thing. In Colombia, you go to a part of rural Colombia, with some Bogotanos, and they could be on the moon or Mars. They just have no idea what goes on or what happens, or they're more comfortable in Miami than on the other side of the Sierra in Bogota. So that's Chile seems to have a little bit of that problem as well. And I think Chile has a very common Latin American problem of having a constitution which was written undemocratically, illegitimately by the military, and that's the problem that's going to be solved. But I think you have to understand you're not going to solve that problem in one go. That's a process. Like part of the theory in the book is that it's a process. Constitutions are important because they enshrine inclusive principles. They enshrine the distribution of power in society. They can help by introducing rights, or and I think I could talk about the 1991 Colombian constitution, which is a very complicated. I don't think that's a role model whatsoever for Chileans, but it did generate some big important advances for indigenous people, for Afro-Colombians. This whole notion of like tutela and kind of complaining that your rights were being. It's an interesting thing. You should talk to. There's a lot of constitutional people in Colombia, at El Externado at the university, who know a lot about that. But it's good to ask them about the pros and cons. And one more thing, and to me this is when people ask me, do I see exciting things happening in Latin America? Where do I see exciting things happening? I think Chile is a great success story. Chile is a story of prosperity and much more effective state capacity than most Latin American countries. People are still upset about lots of things, and that's a legitimate thing. It's legitimate for people to be upset, and it's legitimate for people to protest. And I think that's very healthy that in Chile, you're going through a process of thinking about that and deliberating and understanding it and dealing with it. And that's a healthy democratic process. And that's part of this corridor, that's part of this Red Queen effect. But I also think, that Chile, like everywhere in Latin America, is sort of struggling with its identity. Like when if you read the history of Latin America and like some of the great theorists of Latin America, Bolivar or Jose Marti or Jose Vasconcelos, like the great Mexican intellectual in the 1920s, they say like, well, Latin America, it's not like the United States. We're different. We don't want to think of ourselves as like a bad version of the United States. We don't want to, we want to aspire to be something different, to create a different identity, a Latin American identity, a cultural identity. And I think that, to me, I see many parts of Latin America struggling with that. Bolivia, Peru, and I think Chile hasn't gone through that process yet. It still has this Spanish, Hispanic, colonial kind of society, and it needs to rethink that and develop a new kind of identity, it seems to me. And that's a very healthy, it's a difficult process, but it's a very healthy process. Like, I'll say one more thing and then I can shut up. I have a very close Peruvian friend, and he always says, like, here's the way to think about this. In Peru, they like arroz con mariscos, okay, which is like what? It's basically like a bad paella. It's like bad paella. It's like, that's what people say. It's bad paella. We came from Spain, we brought culture, it's sort of Peru, so we can't really make it properly, but there's this moment, there's a moment where you stop thinking about it as bad paella, and you start thinking about it as arroz con mariscos. And then you start thinking, who cares about paella? That's some Spanish thing, like we have arroz con mariscos in here in Peru. And there's a shift in your worldview and your sense of yourself and your sense of your country and your continent. And that's, to me, where Latin America should be aspiring, and it should be dreaming, and it should be, that's something kind of unimaginable to me in Colombia. Like, it's happening in Peru, it's happening in Bolivia, and it's a kind of crazy situation, and it's not easy to exit from that past, But Chile seems to be the one place where you really have a hope of creating an inclusive and different type of society. There's a lot to be proud and excited about in Chile. And so as an outsider, I'm very happy to be watching that process in real time.
Well, you see, that's what we wish. We would like to create an inclusive society, as you suggest. But it's hard because, the, so to speak, conservative forces and those who have been living with privileges over the years and decades and generations, they will not very easily lose what they have got in their time. So I would like to, if we can discuss about the Constituent Assembly as a mechanism, as a device for not just transferring power from one oligarchic group to another oligarchic group, but just to a widespread dispersion of power within society. You mentioned two very important things, and I believe that most of the people that will hear this lecture or conversation, they will agree with your 2 points, that there is an oligarchic society and hegemonic position of some groups in basically in Santiago. It's a bit larger than that, but it's basically in Santiago, which centralizes the political and economic power. That's clear. And the other point that you mentioned, which is very important, is that the political elites, which are out of touch with what's going on in society. I believe most of the people will agree on these two grounds. So the point is how a Constituent Assembly can help in challenging these two facts. And we have, well, there are some other Latin American Constituent Assemblies, which I believe that what they basically did was to transfer power from one oligarchy to another one. This is clearly, I think, the case of Venezuela. So in the case of Venezuela, there was an oligarchic society with that political class out of touch with this, exactly your 2 points, and that was transferred to a different group.
Yeah.
But the nature of the problem remained the same. So what could you eventually suggest in terms of, if you agree with that, what could you eventually suggest for the workings of this constituent assembly in such a way that we can really challenge these two very important points that you mentioned?
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, Argentina is the same thing happened. The transition from the old oligarchy to the Peronists flipped from one elite to a different elite. So I think you have to be cautious and not too ambitious and not pretend you can solve. I think one of the problems with the Colombian constitution was that, a third of the delegates were from M19, that were this demobilized kind of leftist guerrilla group. And they thought this was their moment to change the whole country, and so they couldn't agree on stuff, and they didn't want to deliberate either. They just wanted to get what they wanted, so it was like a dialogue of the deaf in some sense. And so I think, first of all, you don't, like the British, I always say in Colombia, like the British way of the Colombians always want to get rid of this, solve this problem, solve the agrarian problem, solve the problem of the elites. The British never did that. Most European countries never did that. You grandfather the elites out. You don't threaten them. Like think about Chile in the 1970s. You see what happens when you threaten elites. It's a catastrophe for everybody. So you just have to, that's power. Power is there and you can't deny power. So I think it's a gradual process. Like I said, you can't solve all the problems instantly. It's a gradual process. So you move towards something more inclusive and more legitimate, but you don't threaten elite interests. In Britain, elite interests have never been threatened in Britain. That's part of the genius of the model, was that society could change in many ways. There'd be huge kind of upward mobility, new opportunities, new entrepreneurs, but the elites were fine. The elites were fine. They were never threatened by that. They were never threatened by the building of a modern state. They were never threatened by that emergence of an industrial economy. So I think that's a good model. It's a good model. It's a model which is much more likely to actually move Chile in a really progressive direction.
Even though at some point the taxes in Britain were extremely high. I mean, in the 70s, the marginal income tax for high wealth individuals were close to 95%.
Yeah,
I would like if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, because when you say they were not threatened, it doesn't mean that they didn't pay more taxes than decades before. So they were not threatened in terms of expropriation. They were not threatened in terms of what?
I think that's that's also a very transitory moment. That didn't last more than 20 years. And I think that was the outcome of a very specific moment, which was the Second World War. In some sense, the Second World War created this enormous sort of cohesion in society. Like for the first time, if you look at the army, the first time aristocrats and elites mixed with poor people and working class people. And I think they empathized in a kind of very deep way that they never had before with people's problems, with social problems, and so there was a consensus about the need to build health system and infrastructure and unemployment insurance. And, that had disappeared by the 1970s. It lasted as long as the people who served in the war lived, in some sense. Richard Titmuss, the great British sociologist, wrote about this. And so I think that's a moment. That's a moment. And I think the elites were not threatened because they were kind of part of the solution. They sympathized and they kind of dreamed that but then by the 1970s it disappeared and Mrs. Thatcher came back, and then the elites were kind of like, we separate ourselves. But
don't you think there was some form of learning by the British society? Because nevertheless, I presume, I'm not sure, this is a question, that current degrees of inequality, not just on monetary terms, but also in other terms, are very different in Britain now as compared to the 20s or
Well, inequality is back up to what it was before the Second World War now. Yeah, in the 1930s in Britain. Yeah, inequality,
Income.
wealth inequality is
Yeah.
still much lower, but income inequality is back to what it was in the 1930s. And I, yeah, I mean, I think that's the triumph of the Thatcher revolution, you know, which you could say was a reaction to this post-war, when the post-war consensus unraveled. A very, you know, kind of radical free market model took off, and you know, and there's never really been an adjustment. You know, in some sense, when Tony Blair was prime minister, there was an attempt to readjust, but Tony Blair accepted many of the precepts of that free market model. So it was never really challenged. And I think that's I think it's too early to say what's going to happen with that. I think there hasn't really been, you know, it's like what's happened in the United States, that people are very preoccupied with all these identity type issues like Brexit, and so that stops people really thinking about this inequality and how to cope with it, so I do think so when I say the elites were not threatened, I'm sort of taking a kind of long historical picture, and you know, if you think about, you know, but yes, there was that period too but it was a very consensual. That was not like redistribution under you know, Salvador Allende's government. You know, there was just a lot of consensus. You know, if you look at the end of the Second World War, the Conservative Party, there was kind of cross-political consensus about these things that needed to happen, and that's what allowed it to happen. But that disappeared by the 1970s, so it was a transitory thing.
Yeah. Now let me. I would like to raise 2 points. One has to do with the political system, political regime, and then something concerning the welfare state. So you say correctly, I think, that this is a process, that you shouldn't believe that all solutions will come just after the new constitution is signed. That's very clear, and that this will be a process. So to what extent do you think that changing the nature of the political regime can help in providing conditions for making that process credible? If you have a presidential regime, as we have here, the power of the president is so large, in particular in such an oligarchic country as you just mentioned, that I'm not sure whether it is credible that the process will really change things. And eventually, and this is one of the platforms many people here, including myself, are trying to put forward, is that we need to change the political regime, reducing the power of the president and transferring power elsewhere in society and politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a good thing. You know, I think there's a lot of evidence in social science that, you know, parliamentary regimes do much better, you know, in terms of public good provision and accountability and less corruption. And, you know, so I think that's right. You know, so that sounds like a good thing. I mean, I think Latin America is a sort of paradoxical mixture, isn't it, of like immense legalism and illegalism. You know, the sort of at the one hand, you know, there's this obsession with law, and at the same time there's this obedezco pero no cumplo. You know, there's sort of like there's a culture of like ignoring the law. So that's very accentuated in Colombia. You know, in Colombia, it's just full of all these social norms which kind of justify, you know, ignoring rules and like not sanctioning people. You know, this whole thing about the sapo, you know, no se sapo, don't be a sapo. You know, if you see something going wrong or someone cheating, stay out of it. It's none of your business. Let them get on with it. You know, like so. But I think Chile is much less like that. Chile is much more a kind of has much more rule of law maybe than any other Latin American country. You know, so I think even in Colombia, you can see the constitution. It was very imperfectly implemented in many ways, you know, like the current peace agreement with the guerrilla, but it did change things. So I think if that can happen in Colombia, it can certainly happen. It can certainly happen in Chile. So I think there is scope for reorganizing institutions and making them more inclusive and spreading power in the society. Yes.
Now, concerning the rule of law in Chile, unfortunately, in the last, couple of years, 5 years or so or more, there is a decrease, I would say, in the appreciation for that rule of law, with some important events of corruption, important, significant event of corruptions, of many different types of collusion of large firms. So unfortunately, that is, we used to think that we had a very strong rule of law in Chile. We are unfortunately living a period in which this is declining to some extent. But let me come back to social protection and the welfare state. How do you see the role of social protection and the welfare state in this narrow corridor? Do you think does it play a role in allowing societies to get more cohesion, where you can have better instruments with which to deal with the losers of the economic growth process? How do you see that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, we have quite a bit of discussion of this construction of social democracy, for example, in the 1930s in Scandinavia, where that was a sort of political negotiation, a political coalition, which brought many people together and kind of created common ground that previously hadn't existed. If you go back to the 1920s, actually, Norway and Sweden have more labor disputes and strikes than any other part of Europe. It was not a harmonious. People have this image of Scandinavia as sort of harmonious, very culturally homogeneous, but actually it was very factious in terms of class conflict. At the end of the First World War, even though Sweden was neutral in the First World War, there was almost a communist revolution in Sweden at the end of the war. So I think that, they built. A lot of what you see is actually constructed. It's constructed by social democracy, by making everyone think they have a stake in the society and that, and they have an interest in it prospering, and it creates a mechanism for people to make concessions and give and toing and froing. And so I think it's very important. I think, of course, you can only do what you can afford. So you can't jump. You can't jump straight to Swedish style social democracy or welfare state, but you can take steps towards that. So I think that's a that shows a commitment to sharing wealth and sharing prosperity. And I do think it's an important element in constructing consensus. But I think, in some sense, like the British example that you gave is an interesting example where the rates of taxation became so punitive that the consensus disintegrated, basically. And that was in retrospect, that was a disaster. If they'd only adjusted that in the 1960s, there might be much more of a welfare state. There is something in Britain still. Look at the national health system. It's been like an absolute triumph in the vaccine campaign. So it still functions, but many things are very eroded compared to what they were in the 1960s or 1970s. But but I do think it's important. Yeah.
So I believe you're saying that the way to move forward in this narrow corridor is a kind of you mentioned the balance, some form of free enterprise on the one hand, with a strong state in order to enforce contracts, not just so that, but also to create the social conditions such that you can manage the tensions created by the process of creative destruction that basically drives the way upwards.
Yeah, and I don't know what the best way to do this in Chile is, but I, like a key aspect of this social mobility is trying to make opportunities more equally spread and trying to open things. I always like to give the example, I work a lot in Congo, and in Congo, like think about Australia, so for example, what's Australia like? It's like Chile, there's like copper and bauxite and minerals, and you never bought a manufactured good from Australia. You never bought anything that was manufactured in Australia. It's completely natural resource based. Okay, so how did the Australians get so wealthy? They invested in education. They invested in human capital. You could be in the middle of Congo and you could run into an Australian mining engineer. I never met a Chilean from the Antofagasta copper company in Congo. So the Australians globalized. They took what they were good at and they globalized it, and they competed on a global scale. And so that opening has to come in Chile. That social mobility, and I don't think that's not easy to engineer in a constitution. It's not easy to think how to do that. But that aspect of competition in society, also of that's egregiously absent in Colombia, for example, or most Latin American countries. But that's something to think about. What tools do you have? What instruments? Not ambition. Like just what would move that in the right direction.
Yeah. You mentioned a few minutes ago the problem of identity, and you mentioned the Latin American identity by Bolivar and Vasconcelos, trying to make it different from the identity of the nascent American United States. But there is something into the Chileans, at least officially, at least the oligarchy, if you want, used to see themselves quite proudly as the British of Latin America. Have you heard that? Yeah, we are the British of Latin America. I don't know why they say that, but well, that's what they said. Okay. But now in this Constitutional Assembly, there will be, for the first time in history, not just a constitution written not by military, which was the case or not military, but by a dictatorship in the 80s, but also by a significant proportion of Aboriginal people. So there are reserved pieces for Aboriginal people, and that's very new from all our previous history in terms of redacting and writing constitutions. And it will also be a total parity between men and women, ex post, not ex ante, because in other assemblies it was ex ante, but here will be ex post. So the final Constituent Assembly will be half and half, and that's a very interesting thing as well. But concerning identity, can you elaborate a little bit on how important you think identity is for a social contract to be successful?
I think that if you look at data, and ask, how, and like you compare different parts of the world, Latin America with Africa or Europe or Asia or North America, what is it that jumps out? It's inequality. It's the lack of social mobility. Compared to any other place in the world, your parents' income or your parents' education most closely predicts your income or education in Latin America. That's more than anywhere. North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, you name it. Africa, even Africa. Okay, so that this is like what is that? And where did that inequality come from? Where did that society, that hierarchical, unequal society come from? And it came from the colonial period. It came from hundreds of years of exploitation of indigenous people and black people and so that's where it came from. And I think like that's maybe it's even so, like think about that film Roma. I'm sure you all saw the film Roma. Like there's a depiction of the Mexican society film of castas in Mexico, and so I think, how does Latin America break out of that? It's almost like subconscious, it's like a sort of subconscious thing. You go in Colombia, you go into some rich person, Bogotano's house, all the maids and the hierarchy, and they're not even aware of it, And I think somehow you have to dismount for Latin America to really explode and kind of fulfill its promise economically, culturally, politically, everything else. Now is your moment, because the United States is going down the toilet. Like look at what's happened to the Republican Party. The Republican Party is like something like the Chavistas at this point, like just unreconstructed. This is not about Trump. It's the party. The whole party is full of nutcases, who don't care about democracy. It's absolutely frightening. It's just frightening what's happened in this country. So now is your moment, and I think that needs some sort of reinvention of what it means to be Latin America. Like to go back to the Peruvian example, it's very interesting. In the 1980s, when Alan Garcia was disastrously president in the late 1980s. he made a coalition with what he called the 10 apostles. 10 apostles. Look it up on Google. Now, the 10 apostles. Who were the 10 apostles? Like these limeño, white limeño elites, Italian names. People who came from the 19th century with and whatever. Okay. Now they have in Peru a sort of updated 10 apostles, the 10 new apostles. Half of them are they're from, first of all, they're not from Lima. Half of them are from, they're from Ayacucho, they're from Cajamarca, they're from Cusco, they're from the provinces, they're from the interior. And you look at them, they're what in Peru you call, this is a difficult word for me to use, but in Peru they'd say they're cholo. President Toledo used to say, call me cholo, just a cholo. What is that? That's a new kind of mestizo identity which is appearing in Peru, and it's connected to Fujimorismo in some twisted way, but it's connected to the food. Look at the food, look at the restaurants, there's this kind of cultural dynamism in Peru that I find incredibly exciting. And so I think that's an example of some very different type of identity and society is emerging, which is not like a failed version of the United States. It's something completely different. And I like that a lot.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing I believe it's important is to mention the potentialities of bringing together different cultural traditions that can discover among themselves new things, and that's a very important element. Now, one question: when you just think about those few countries who have been successful in moving upwards through the corridor, let's say, and I will mention the ones that I would like to mention just because of they feel the hypothesis is Korea, Taiwan, Finland, and Singapore. They all are different in different times, but they share one thing. So my question is whether the thing that they share is, do you think, a kind of necessary condition for development? That necessary condition is to some extent some external threat. In the war in Europe, we just discussed that it was an actual threat that materialized, and that led society to change their minds and to change the social contract. In these other countries, well, there was some, of course, some materialization as well, because in Korea there was this war and the country was divided. Taiwan was an externalization of the Chinese. So to what extent do you think this learning, social learning, is it possible to have social learning and social disciplination, so to speak, without the need to receive an external threat as those countries faced?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're right that the threat, that these countries face did have the consequence of, making people work together. I actually had a PhD student who's from Finland who did his dissertation on, at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union basically said, you have to give us all of this stuff, otherwise we're going to invade you. And that stuff was what, like trains and manufactured goods and trucks and the Finns, boats, and the Finns hardly knew how to do all of that, but they had to learn very fast, because Stalin was serious. And they did, and it had a very persistent effect on the economy. But I think, I do think that helps create kind of solidarity or cooperation. We bury our differences because we've got to work together because there's this huge challenge. And you see that in the war. I mean, it's not unrelated to what I was talking about earlier in Britain, that, there is this sense of, we need to work together. This is a heck of a problem. If we don't cooperate, we're never going to solve it. And so, but I think the British case is also interesting, because that it didn't last, in the British case. And I think for every example, I don't think it's necessary or sufficient. I think you can find plenty of countries that have managed to generate much more inclusive institutions without any kind of external threat. And I'm not sure it's sufficient either, because some societies which face external threats just sort of collapse, under the weight of it,
Yes, of
or
course.
they never stop fighting. Like,
Yeah.
look, think about think about when the Islamic State invaded the northern third of Iraq. They still couldn't form a government in Baghdad. They just argued and negotiated and argued, and they just couldn't bury their differences. So I mean, maybe that's a particularly intractable problem.
So
I don't
which
think,
countries?
yeah.
Which countries do you have in mind when you think about this social learning, about cooperation and solidarity without external threats? What countries do you have in mind there?
I think there's some very interesting examples of that, of very diverse countries like Mauritius. One of the great economic success stories of the last 50 years is Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Mauritius is an incredibly complicated country, ethno-linguistically, historically. There's all these Indian people, there's Chinese people, there's black people, kind of the descendants of former slaves. You have kind of what they call les grands blancs, which are like the French white people who own all the sugarcane plantations. It looks like a recipe for disaster, but they've been terrifically successful at industrializing since the 1970s. Now they're investing in education, in services, in banking, in financial intermediation. So they diversified out of, when China started expanding, they realized there wasn't much future in manufacturing, and they diversified out of it. And so they found mechanisms for defining goals and reconciling the different groups to each other and living, so I think there's no external threat to Mauritius. They're not threatened by anybody. I mean, places that
By
we
the sea. By social warming and the sea and the
yeah, that's true. We talk about, in the book, we talk about Botswana, which is the terrific success story in Africa, about how Botswana built these, they built on traditional pre-colonial institutions of accountability and consensus, and you go to any town in Botswana, they all have these little hotlas, they call them, which are like these meeting places, and you'll see hundreds of people sitting around, in the sun, kind of discussing and debating. And so I think that's so there are success stories. And I think, like, just think about Norway or something, like Norway, or again, there was no external threat, but the Norwegians were able to build very powerful institutions. I have a Norwegian colleague I worked with a lot for many, many years. He's called Torvik. And, he's from a town in Norway called Torvik. And the mayor is Torvik. And I always say, if this was Brazil, that would be a real disaster. But it's Norway, so it's okay,
Let me now switch to one very important institution that in your previous book you give a lot of relevance to it, which is private property. Private property is one institution which, in that book, Why Nations Fail, is an inclusive institution. Now, I have here two questions. One is, how do you think, if it's possible to define it briefly in your view, how can you define a successful definition of private property? Because when we think about private property, we tend to think about a private good, such as this cookie. Okay, so this cookie, this is my property, and then I do with it what I want to do with it. I can eat it or leave it there. Okay. But in terms of more common goods, the definition of what's the proper inclusive approach to property of those goods, it's more tricky, because in the case of water, for example, it's very difficult. It's not just a matter of this is my water, because it plays a very critical role in many areas of the country, in very productive sectors. It's essential to life. So my point here is, how is your reflection concerning private property, but in the case of these common goods, such as, for example, water or clean air or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of these natural resources are complicated to allocate, because on the one, I mean, I think there's very different rules in different parts of the world on things like that, but I think that and that's also complicated, I guess, in a place like Chile, because maybe there's competing claims. You know, there's indigenous people who claim that this is their land and this is their territory and this is their water and they want it back and you can't have it. You know, and so I think that's, you know, I think the history of you know, successful societies are you create a mechanism for negotiating that. I think, you know, in the Chilean case, I can see the rationale for saying, you know, like in many parts of the world, in New Zealand and Australia, for example, they are recognizing the property rights of indigenous people over natural resources, over assets. And I think the crucial thing is just to create a mechanism for negotiating and for, you know, allowing people to sort of say, you know, often very symbolically, yes, this is our, you know, this is ours, like Uluru, Ayers Rock in the middle of Australia. This is Aboriginal, this is a holy site for Aboriginal people. It's a sacred site for Aboriginal people. And, you know, white people get off it. And yeah, the white people should get off it, you know? Like, what would people say if Aboriginals were climbing all over St. Peter's Basilica in Rome? You know, we'd say, get off it. You know, that's a holy place, but that is a holy place for Aboriginal people. And so the white people should get off it. So I think you have to recognize these things but just find a process for sort of, you know, kind of negotiating. Okay, fine. So we respect your property rights. And, you know, and so, but, you know, this is for all Chileans. So this resource is for Chileans and we're going to pay you for it and we're going to recognize, you know, so I don't know the details of these things. I understand they're complicated, you know, but I think one of the most interesting historical experiences, you know, in something like this is in Britain, actually in the early modern period, where there was vast amounts of common land, which was enclosed and privatized. Basically, the property rights were privatized. But the interesting thing about that is that the government never did anything except provide a mechanism whereby the local people themselves could come to an agreement. You know, the government didn't force anything. The local people themselves came to an agreement. It's a very good model, you know.
And so that gave rise to many different approaches to solving Absolutely. The problem?
Yes, it did many different approaches. It's crazy, you know, you don't know that, but it's a crazy patchwork of things in Britain at the local level, but very, very complicated, you know, and I think because local people can adapt to the circumstances and the history and you know, I don't know what the problem is in Chile, but or you know, or what the solution is, but I think, you know, there's many interesting things going on in Australia and New Zealand with respect to this, you know, with respect to indigenous ownership of natural resources and water and all sorts of things. You know, it's like in the United States, you know, like the way Black people were treated in this country. It's like an original sin. It's an incredible mark on this society. It's like such a burden on the United States, this treatment of Black people, the discrimination of Black people, the marginalization of Black people, the brutality against Black people. Yeah. You know, this country has never been able to solve that problem, you know, and you have to, like, somehow you have to solve that problem. You know, if you're going to move on, you have to recognize what happened. You know, what happened was the place was invaded and indigenous people were desecrated and their land was stolen and Black people were brought in slaves, and you can't just say, you know, oh, okay, fine, just don't worry about that. You know, I think that's, you know, like one of my Colombian friends who's in politics, he always says the most important thing in politics, I don't need to tell you this, you're a politician, but the most important thing in politics is respect. You have to respect people, you know, and I think they haven't got to that in the United States, you know, and I think that's my sense in Australia and New Zealand. There's been an enormous transformation in terms of respecting people, and that's a terribly healthy thing for the future of the society.
Sure. Can I have one more question? Do you have a few minutes?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So the point has to do with decentralization. You know, Chile is a unified country, unitario. I don't know how to translate that, Unitarian country. But of course, there are some people claiming that we should move towards a kind of regional state, a little bit closer to Spain, some other people are moving even beyond that, because there's a large Aborigine people called Mapuche that you probably know. I believe you mentioned it on the other book. And some people is claiming that they should have autonomy over their territories. So how can you, what's your reflection on these centripetal forces in some countries that try to pull, not together, but to separate? I mean, and you live in a country, or not, you don't live in a country, but you come from a country which is to some extent suffering this, with the case of Scotland and eventually Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah, but Great Britain, to me, there's no such thing. Great Britain is a colonial empire. Scotland should be independent, if you want my advice. Like or Ireland, fought for its independence in the 1920s. I think Wales, also Welsh identity is very distinct. Language is very distinct, and but Wales is so full of English people now. I don't think it's very difficult to have. But I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I would have been happy if Scotland had voted to become independent. So the English state wreaked havoc, in Scotland in the 18th century. They murdered people, they expropriated land, they destroyed Scottish institutions. It was terrible. So I think this is fine. I mean, I understand it's difficult to manage, like in Spain, with Catalonia and the Basque, but you must have been in the Basque country. That's got nothing to do with the Spanish. It's like the language is different. It's a completely different. Like, why not give those people autonomy? To kind of allow themselves to organize their society the way they want. I do think people that's important to people. Recognizing that, and I don't think that's a disaster in Chile or anywhere else.
The difficult thing here. Is that you have in those same places, I mean, of course, the Aboriginal people were there much before the arriving of the Spaniards, that's for sure. But I mean, 200 years ago, a bit less, 120 years ago, there was a full a flow of immigrants that came to those same places, and they've been living there for generations as well. So they claim that it is their right to remain there as well. So you need to provide some common ground for people coming from different cultures, for example, German or Croatian or Spanish or Italian cultures, and the Mapuche people. Do you have any reflection on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not advocating a dictatorship of the Mapuche, but I do think, I mean, this is something that decentralization can help with, that you decentralize power and you decentralize resources, but of course that needs to be inclusive, in the south of Chile too, so that these other people also are represented and their interests are respected, and so I don't think, this is not supposed to be like an Indian reservation where the Navajo are citizens and nobody else is, or whatever. I think this is, so, and I understand, you could think about, there's interesting research on this, for example, in Catalonia, where the Spanish government tried to sort of, they tried to make concessions to the Catalans, and in the hope that it would kind of keep Spain more together, but actually had the opposite consequence. So, and one of the things that the Spanish government did, which was they decentralized control over the schooling system. So then the Catalans were able to sort of promote a kind of segregate, a kind of secessionist ideology, and in the local school system. So I think that there's something to learn from that. I think how you do it is important. I think that the political problems caused by these countries disintegrating, I think that's to be avoided. But I think decentralizing power and resources to them, as you say, in a country which is so centralized, would be a good thing. I mean, I think in the Colombian case, that has been a good thing, the decentralization that happened in the 1980s, even before the constitution, the election of mayors, that's had many interesting consequences, I think, and good consequences too. I mean, although,
yeah. Well, thank you very much. We reached the hour time that we arranged. I'm really very grateful for you, James. I hope your very quick but very deep thoughts will help us to understand a little bit more the challenges we have ahead, and to illuminate some of the paths that we can follow looking forward. I encourage our fellow Chileans to take a look at el estrecho corredor, el corredor estrecho. The book is being sold. I'm not and I don't have any commission by James by this publicity. Yeah?
I have a copy here. Yeah.
But I suggest taking a, yeah, exactly, yeah, El Pasillo Estrecho, ese libro. I have it with me, but I left it on the car, so I don't have it here with me now. But it's a very interesting book. I think it's very useful. In particular, the third chapter or the second one, in which you develop the full, very simple way of understanding what's going on here. So, thank you very much, James, once again, and I hope that once the Constituent Assembly start working, we shall come back together to discuss what is at stake here.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, good luck. Yeah, it's a very exciting moment for Chile, I think. So no pressure, as they say in the United States.
Well, it's up to us to make it
yes, absolutely
for everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, James,
yes.
once again.
Okay.
And,
My pleasure.
muchas gracias a todas ustedes por acompañarnos esta noche. Lo que hemos hablado con James va a estar traducido en el sitio web nuestro, guillermoconstituyente.cl, si es que alguien no pudo oír la traducción. Muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Okay.
Bye, James. Thank you very much.